They thought they were throwing a poor woman out of first class that morning, but before the flight ever left the gate, the entire airline was about to learn the cost of humiliating the wrong person. The soft golden lights of Terminal B reflected against polished marble floors as passengers drifted toward the international departure gates of Atlantic Crown Airlines. Expensive rolling suitcases clicked across the terminal, while businessmen in tailored navy suits checked their watches and flight attendants moved through the crowd with polished smiles that looked practiced rather than sincere. Near Gate 14, Evelyn Carter stood quietly beside the boarding lane, one hand resting on the handle of an old gray carry-on bag that looked far too worn for the luxury cabin she was about to enter. At 38, Evelyn carried herself with calm dignity, though nothing about her appearance suggested wealth. Her light beige sweater was simple, her white sneakers slightly faded, and her blonde hair tied loosely behind her neck. To most people passing by, she looked like an ordinary woman catching a delayed flight after a long week. And that was exactly how Evelyn preferred it. Years earlier, before her husband became one of the most influential figures in the aviation industry, she had promised herself never to become the kind of person who measured human worth through designer labels and polished appearances. While others chased status, Evelyn quietly invested her time into educational charities and children's literacy programs across the country. She believed kindness mattered more than wealth. Unfortunately, not everyone inside Atlantic Crown Airlines shared that belief. First-class boarding now, the gate agent announced through the speaker system. The line immediately shifted as wealthy passengers stepped forward with quiet entitlement, some barely acknowledging the employees scanning their passes. Evelyn waited patiently until the crowd thinned before approaching the gate with a gentle smile. "Good morning," she said softly, handing over her boarding pass. The young gate agent scanned it, but her expression changed almost instantly. Her eyes moved from the screen to Evelyn's clothes, then back to the screen again. "One moment," she said carefully. Evelyn remained calm. "Of course." The agent rescanned the ticket twice more before forcing a polite smile that failed to hide the uncertainty in her eyes. "You're in seat 2A?" she asked. "That's right." Behind Evelyn, a sharply dressed woman wearing oversized sunglasses and a cream-colored designer coat glanced over with visible irritation. "Is there a problem?" she asked loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. The gate agent hesitated. "No, ma'am. Just a system verification." The woman's eyes narrowed as she looked Evelyn up and down. "First class?" she muttered quietly to the man beside her. "Interesting." Evelyn heard the comment, but chose not to respond. She simply accepted her boarding pass and walked down the jet bridge in silence. The aircraft cabin glowed with soft amber lighting, the wide leather seats arranged in private suites with polished wood finishes and crystal water glasses already prepared beside each seat. A flight attendant greeted passengers near the entrance with the warm smile expected from luxury service, but when Evelyn stepped aboard, the woman's expression briefly faltered. "Welcome aboard," the attendant said, though her tone carried hesitation. Evelyn nodded politely and moved toward seat 2A near the front window. As she placed her small carry-on beneath the seat compartment, she noticed another flight attendant whispering something while glancing in her direction. The older businessman seated across the aisle lowered his newspaper slightly, studying her with open curiosity. Then came the whispering. Quiet at first, barely audible, but enough. "Maybe she's in the wrong cabin. Probably upgraded by accident. Did you see her bag?" Evelyn stared calmly out the oval window at the rain-covered runway lights glowing against the early morning fog. She had experienced moments like this before. Wealthy people often assumed simplicity meant weakness. They mistook humility for lower status because they had spent too long living in environments where appearances mattered more than character. A few minutes later, the lead flight attendant approached her seat, holding a tablet. Her polished smile looked thinner this time. "Ma'am," she said softly, "may I see your boarding pass again?" Evelyn handed it over without argument. The attendant examined the screen carefully, then glanced at Evelyn's sweater before looking back at the tablet once more. "I apologize," she said, though her expression suggested otherwise. "There appears to be a discrepancy with your seating assignment." The cabin slowly grew quieter. Nearby passengers pretended not to listen while clearly listening to every word. Evelyn remained composed. "A discrepancy?" "Yes, ma'am." The attendant straightened slightly. There may have been an issue during check-in. The woman in the designer coat smirked openly now, folding her arms as if the situation had already confirmed her suspicions. Across the aisle, someone quietly lifted a phone beneath the armrest, preparing to record what might happen next. Evelyn noticed all of it. The stares, the judgment, the anticipation. But her face never changed. Because what none of them understood was that somewhere far above the clouds, long before this flight would ever take off, a single phone call was already moving through the executive offices of Atlantic Crown Airlines. And by the time that call reached the cockpit, the people humiliating Evelyn Carter would wish they had treated her with simple human decency. The lead flight attendant continued staring at the tablet for several uncomfortable seconds while the silence inside the cabin slowly thickened. The soft hum of the aircraft ventilation seemed louder now, mixing with the distant clatter of luggage bins closing farther down the aisle. Evelyn sat perfectly still beside the window, her hands folded calmly in her lap, while the passengers around her watched with growing curiosity. "What kind of discrepancy?" Evelyn finally asked quietly. The attendant forced another corporate smile, though tension was beginning to show around her eyes. "It appears there may have been an issue connected to the reservation profile attached to this seat." Evelyn nodded once. "I booked the ticket 3 weeks ago." "I understand, ma'am." The attendant glanced again at Evelyn's sweater and faded carry-on bag. "But first-class reservations on this route are usually tied to verified executive accounts." The implication hung heavily in the air. Nearby passengers exchanged knowing looks. The woman in the cream-colored coat leaned back in her seat with visible satisfaction, as though she had already decided exactly who Evelyn was. "I knew something felt off," she whispered to the man beside her. "People always try to sneak into premium cabins." The man chuckled quietly. Evelyn heard every word, but her expression never shifted. Years ago, comments like that might have hurt her. Back before she learned how quickly people revealed themselves when they believed someone lacked status. Now she simply observed them with the quiet sadness of someone who understood that wealth often exposed character rather than improved it. The attendant cleared her throat. "Would you mind stepping with me to the front galley while we resolve this?" Several heads turned immediately. A younger passenger across the aisle lowered his headphones completely now, openly watching. Somewhere near the back of the cabin, a phone camera subtly tilted upward again. Evelyn slowly stood from her seat. The movement was graceful, controlled, almost gentle. No anger, no embarrassment, just dignity. And somehow that composure unsettled the flight attendant more than outrage would have. As Evelyn followed her toward the front galley, the polished heels of the attendant clicked sharply against the cabin floor, while Evelyn's quiet footsteps barely made a sound behind her. The contrast between them felt impossible to ignore. Near the cockpit entrance, the attendant lowered her voice. "Ma'am, I need to ask directly. Did someone purchase this ticket for a brief moment?" Nobody inside the cabin moved. The silence felt strange now, heavier than before, as though everyone sensed they were watching something they would later regret. Evelyn stood near the front galley with calm eyes while Cynthia maintained the stiff posture of someone trying desperately to stay in control of a situation already slipping beyond her understanding. Outside the cabin, Evelyn repeated softly, "Yes, ma'am," Cynthia replied, her voice tightening under the attention of the surrounding passengers. "Until we can properly verify your reservation status." Evelyn glanced once toward seat 2, where her small carry-on bag still rested beneath the seat. The younger attendant shifted uncomfortably nearby, clearly uneasy with how public the situation had become. But Cynthia was too committed now to reverse course. Pride had already entered the equation, and pride often pushed people further than cruelty ever could. The woman in the cream-colored coat gave a small laugh from her seat. "Honestly, this should have been handled before boarding." Several passengers nodded quietly in agreement. One older man folded his newspaper with visible annoyance. "We paid for premium service," he muttered. Not confusion. Evelyn lowered her eyes for just a second, not out of shame, but disappointment. She had spent years funding scholarships for children whose families could barely afford groceries. She had sat beside homeless veterans at charity dinners and listened to single mothers cry over medical bills. Yet somehow the deepest forms of judgment always came from polished environments like this one, where kindness disappeared beneath expensive fabric and first-class entitlement. Cynthia gestured toward the exit door leading back to the jet bridge. Right this way, please. Every eye in the cabin followed Evelyn as she began walking slowly down the aisle. The atmosphere shifted the moment she moved. Conversations stopped completely. Even the soft background music playing through the cabin speakers suddenly felt distant. The click of Cynthia's heels echoed sharply ahead, while Evelyn's white sneakers made almost no sound against the carpeted floor. It felt less like a routine seating issue now and more like a public removal. Near the center aisle, Evelyn noticed a young mother holding a little girl near the window seat. The child looked at Evelyn with innocent confusion, too young to understand status or embarrassment. Evelyn offered the little girl a gentle smile as she passed. The child smiled back immediately. Children still recognized humanity before hierarchy. Adults often forgot how. Behind them, someone whispered quietly, "This is embarrassing." Another voice answered, "If she could not afford first class, she should not have tried." Evelyn continued walking without reacting. Her composure only made the situation more uncomfortable for the people watching. There was no anger for them to justify their assumptions against. No scene, no argument, just quiet dignity moving through humiliation with unsettling grace. As they reached the aircraft door, the younger attendant suddenly hurried forward again, holding the tablet tightly against her chest. "Cynthia," she whispered nervously, "Operations is asking why passenger Carter has been removed from her assigned seat." Cynthia's expression hardened instantly. "Because verification is incomplete." But they specifically flagged her reservation as protected. Cynthia lowered her voice sharply. "Protected passengers exist on every flight. That does not mean she belongs in first class." Evelyn remained silent beside them while airport staff passing through the jet bridge began noticing the tension near the entrance. A gate supervisor glanced over curiously. Inside the cabin, more passengers were openly staring now, sensing the escalation growing larger than a simple ticket dispute. Then the sound came. A sharp notification tone echoed from Cynthia's tablet. She looked down impatiently at first, expecting another operations message. But the moment she read the screen, the color slowly drained from her face. The younger attendant noticed it immediately. "What is it?" Cynthia did not answer. Her eyes remained frozen on the flashing red banner across the display. "Executive Operations Alert. Passenger Evelyn Carter. Do not remove under any circumstances." Cynthia stared at the red warning banner as though the screen itself had betrayed her. The confident authority she had carried moments earlier began slipping from her face piece by piece. Around them, the atmosphere near the aircraft entrance shifted almost instantly. Even the younger attendant standing beside her could sense something had gone terribly wrong. "What does it say?" the younger woman asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. Cynthia swallowed, before locking the tablet screen quickly against her chest. "Nothing," she answered too fast. But everyone nearby had already seen her reaction. Evelyn remained calm, standing quietly beside the aircraft door while passengers continued watching openly from their seats. The woman in the cream-colored coat leaned farther into the aisle now, clearly frustrated that the removal process had paused. "Are we delayed because of this?" she asked loudly. Cynthia straightened immediately, trying to regain control. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are resolving a seating verification matter." But the polished confidence in her voice was cracking now. The younger attendant glanced nervously toward Evelyn before speaking carefully. "Should we contact operations back?" Cynthia shot her a sharp look. "I know how to handle this." Yet deep down, she no longer did. Because protected passengers were not ordinary customers. Cynthia had worked luxury cabins for almost 12 years. She knew exactly what executive-level flags meant. Corporate executives, major investors, government officials, people connected to the airline at levels most employees never saw. And now she realized she had publicly escorted one of them out of first class in front of an entire cabin full of witnesses. The realization settled into her stomach like ice. Evelyn noticed the change immediately. Not fear exactly. Something worse. The beginning of regret. Still, she said nothing. Years of charity work had taught her that people revealed their true selves most clearly in moments where they believed there would be no consequences. That was why kindness mattered. Real character appeared when nobody important seemed to be watching. Outside the aircraft windows, Rain continued streaking softly across the glass while ground crew vehicles moved beneath the glowing runway lights. Inside the cabin, however, the air now felt tense and unusually still. Even the businessman across the aisle had stopped pretending to read his newspaper. Cynthia finally forced a tight smile toward Evelyn. "Ma'am, perhaps there has simply been a misunderstanding." The shift in tone was immediate enough that several passengers exchanged glances. Moments earlier, Evelyn had been treated like an inconvenience. Now Cynthia sounded almost cautious. "You asked me to leave the cabin," Evelyn replied quietly. Cynthia hesitated, temporarily, until verification was completed. Evelyn looked at her gently, not angrily. Somehow that made the moment even more uncomfortable. The younger attendant lowered her voice. "Cynthia, operations is calling again." Cynthia took the device with visibly tense hands and answered quickly. "This is lead attendant Cynthia Reynolds." A pause followed. Her expression changed almost instantly. "Yes, she is here." Another silence. Then the remaining color disappeared from her face entirely. Nearby passengers could only hear fragments now. "No, sir. I was not informed." "Yes, sir. I understand." The call ended. Cynthia stood motionless for several seconds before lowering the tablet slowly. The younger attendant looked terrified now. "Who was that?" Cynthia answered quietly without taking her eyes off Evelyn. "Executive operations from headquarters." The words traveled farther through the silent cabin than she intended. Several passengers immediately sat straighter. The woman in the cream-colored coat stopped smirking altogether. Cynthia turned toward Evelyn carefully now, almost as though speaking to someone far more powerful than she had first assumed. "Ma'am," she said softly, "would you please return to your seat?" Evelyn studied her for a brief moment. "Has the discrepancy been resolved?" Cynthia's throat tightened. "Yes, ma'am." Evelyn nodded politely and began walking back down the aisle. But this time, the silence following her felt completely different. Nobody whispered now. Nobody laughed. Because somewhere beyond the cabin walls, people with real authority had finally entered the situation. And everyone on board could feel it. Evelyn returned to seat 2A with the same quiet composure she had shown from the beginning, but the atmosphere inside first class had completely transformed. Just minutes earlier, the passengers had looked at her with suspicion and amusement. Now they avoided direct eye contact altogether. The woman in the cream-colored coat adjusted herself awkwardly in her seat, pretending sudden interest in her phone screen, while the man beside her stared silently toward the aisle. The confidence that had fueled their judgment was fading quickly. Cynthia stood near the galley, gripping the tablet tightly against her side, her posture rigid beneath the polished professionalism she was struggling to maintain. The younger attendant leaned toward her carefully. "Should we inform the captain?" she whispered. Cynthia answered without looking away from Evelyn. "He already knows." Those 4 words sent another ripple of tension through the cabin. Evelyn calmly placed her carry-on bag back beneath the seat and fastened her seat belt with steady hands. The soft click echoed louder than it should have in the silence surrounding her. Outside the aircraft windows, baggage carts moved through the rain while runway lights shimmered across the wet pavement like broken gold. But inside the cabin, nobody seemed focused on the flight anymore. They were focused on her. The businessman across the aisle finally cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said cautiously. Evelyn looked over politely. "I believe there may have been some misunderstanding earlier." Evelyn offered a small, graceful nod. "Perhaps." The man shifted uncomfortably beneath her calm response. He had expected either bitterness or passive acceptance. Instead, her dignity exposed the awkwardness of everyone around her. Near the front galley, Cynthia's tablet vibrated again. She checked the screen instantly, and this time her entire expression tightened with visible alarm. "What now?" the younger attendant whispered nervously. Cynthia lowered her voice. "Corporate security has frozen cabin departure." "Frozen? Nobody boards. Nobody exits. We wait." The younger attendant blinked in confusion. "For who?" Cynthia did not answer immediately because deep down she already suspected the truth. Somewhere above her pay grade, executives were moving quickly now. And when powerful people move that fast inside a billion-dollar airline, it usually meant only one thing. Someone extremely important was involved. The captain suddenly emerged from the cockpit, his expression unusually serious. Several passengers looked up immediately. Captains rarely entered first class before departure unless something significant had happened. Cynthia straightened instantly. Captain Harris. He ignored everyone else and spoke quietly to Cynthia near the galley entrance. Is she on board? Cynthia nodded carefully toward seat 2A. The captain's eyes shifted toward Evelyn for the first time. His face changed immediately. Not shock. Recognition. The kind that came from suddenly understanding a situation far larger than expected. He walked down the aisle personally, stopping beside Evelyn's seat. The entire cabin watched in silence. Even the sound of the rain outside seemed distant now. Mrs. Carter, Captain Harris said respectfully, I want to personally apologize for the inconvenience you experienced this morning. Several passengers exchanged stunned looks. The title alone changed everything. Mrs. Carter, not passenger, not ma'am, spoken with forced politeness. Something about the captain's tone carried genuine caution now. Evelyn looked up calmly. Thank you, Captain. He hesitated before continuing carefully. We are currently awaiting final clearance from executive operations before departure. Evelyn's eyes softened slightly, almost with understanding. I see. Captain Harris lowered his voice further. Your husband has been informed. Cynthia's face lost the last trace of color remaining in it. Across the aisle, the businessman slowly lowered his newspaper completely. The woman in the cream-colored coat stared openly now, unable to hide her confusion anymore. Because everyone in first class understood one thing at that moment. Airlines did not delay flights for ordinary passengers. They certainly did not involve executive operations, corporate security, and the captain himself over a seating issue. Whatever was happening around Evelyn Carter had suddenly become much bigger than first class. And somewhere beyond the rain-covered terminal windows, a black SUV motorcade had just entered airport property. Rain continued tapping softly against the aircraft windows as the tension inside first class became almost impossible to ignore. Nobody complained about the delay anymore. Nobody questioned why the flight remained frozen at the gate. The earlier confidence that had filled the cabin had been replaced by something quieter and far more uncomfortable. Uncertainty. Evelyn remained seated beside the window with her hands resting calmly in her lap, while airport lights reflected gently across the glass beside her. She looked peaceful, almost detached from the chaos surrounding her. But that calmness only deepened everyone else's unease. Cynthia stood near the front galley speaking in hushed tones with Captain Harris while the younger attendant nervously refreshed updates on her tablet every few seconds. Then another message appeared. The younger attendant inhaled sharply. They are here, she whispered. Cynthia looked toward the jet bridge entrance immediately. Through the narrow aircraft doorway, shadows moved beyond the glass corridor connecting the plane to the terminal. Dark suits, security personnel, airport executives. The kind of people passengers rarely saw unless something serious had happened. Conversations inside the cabin stopped completely. Even the businessman across the aisle slowly sat straighter in his seat. The woman in the cream-colored coat lowered her phone into her lap, suddenly unsure whether recording any of this had been a mistake. Captain Harris adjusted his uniform jacket carefully before stepping toward the aircraft entrance himself. That alone told everyone watching that whoever was arriving carried extraordinary authority. A moment later, 3 senior airport executives stepped onto the aircraft in silence. Their polished shoes moved quickly across the carpeted aisle, while their faces carried the tight expressions of people already aware damage had been done. Cynthia immediately straightened. Sir, she began nervously. The oldest executive raised a hand gently without even looking at her. Not now. His eyes had already moved toward Evelyn. The cabin became completely silent. The executive walked down the aisle personally and stopped beside seat 2A. Mrs. Carter, he said respectfully, I sincerely apologize for what occurred this morning. Several passengers visibly froze. Executive-level apologies did not happen on commercial flights. Certainly not in person. Evelyn looked up calmly. It has been a difficult morning for everyone. Her grace only made the surrounding shame feel heavier. The executive lowered his voice. Your husband is on his way to the aircraft now. Cynthia closed her eyes briefly. Across the cabin, the woman in the cream-colored coat looked genuinely pale for the first time. The businessman across the aisle stared openly now, no longer pretending discretion. Because everyone understood the implications. Whoever Evelyn's husband was, senior airline executives were treating him with the caution usually reserved for owners, regulators, or people powerful enough to affect careers overnight. Outside the aircraft windows, headlights suddenly appeared through the rain near the secured service road beside the gate. A line of black vehicles rolled slowly toward the aircraft under airport escort. Ground crew members immediately stepped aside. Security personnel moved quickly into position near the jet bridge entrance. The younger attendant whispered under her breath, "Oh my God." Cynthia said nothing because she already knew. Deep down, she had known ever since the executive operations alert flashed red across her screen. She had not humiliated an ordinary passenger. She had publicly removed someone connected to the very top of the company she worked for. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as boarding systems temporarily paused. Then the aircraft door opened once more. Footsteps approached through the jet bridge. Slow, controlled, confident. The kind of footsteps that made people instinctively stand straighter without understanding why. Captain Harris moved aside immediately. The senior executives turned toward the entrance at once. And when the tall man in the charcoal overcoat finally stepped into the first-class cabin, the entire atmosphere changed in a single breath. Daniel Carter had arrived. Daniel Carter stepped into the cabin with the calm presence of a man completely accustomed to rooms falling silent when he entered them. Rainwater still glistened faintly across the shoulders of his charcoal overcoat while the soft cabin lights reflected against the platinum watch resting beneath his cuff. He was tall, composed, and carried the kind of quiet authority that did not need introduction. The moment the senior executives saw him, every one of them straightened instinctively. "Mr. Carter," the oldest executive said carefully. Daniel gave only a brief nod before his eyes moved through the cabin. Not rushed, not emotional, just focused. Then he saw Evelyn sitting quietly beside the window. The tension in his face softened immediately. "Evelyn," he said gently. She smiled faintly, relieved not because she needed rescuing, but because his presence meant the situation would finally end. Daniel walked down the aisle slowly while passengers watched in complete silence. Cynthia stood frozen near the galley, her hands clasped tightly together now. The confidence she once carried had disappeared entirely. Daniel stopped beside Evelyn's seat and lowered himself slightly so he could look directly at her. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Evelyn nodded once. "I am fine." But Daniel noticed the faint redness near her eyes and the unusual stillness in her posture. After 15 years of marriage, he could always tell when someone had hurt her feelings, even when she tried to hide it. His jaw tightened slightly, not with anger, something colder, disappointment. He stood again and finally turned toward the cabin staff. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Cynthia swallowed hard under his gaze. Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not create a scene. Somehow that made the moment far more intimidating. "Which one of you asked my wife to leave her seat?" he asked calmly. Nobody answered right away. The silence stretched painfully across the cabin. Finally, Cynthia stepped forward carefully. "Sir, there appeared to be a verification issue involving the reservation system." Daniel looked at her for several quiet seconds. "A verification issue," he repeated. Cynthia nodded nervously. "Yes, sir." Daniel glanced briefly toward the executives standing behind him. "Interesting." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a slim black card holder. From it, he pulled a metallic executive identification card and handed it directly to Cynthia. Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted it. The moment she read the name beneath the airline crest, her breathing visibly changed. Chief Executive Chairman, Atlantic Crown Airlines Group. Cynthia looked up slowly, her face completely pale now. Around the cabin, passengers stared in stunned disbelief. The woman in the cream-colored coat covered her mouth with her hand. The businessman across the aisle blinked several times as realization finally settled across the cabin like a wave. Evelyn had not merely been connected to the airline. She was the wife of the man who owned it. Daniel's voice remained calm. "My wife purchased her seat legally 3 weeks ago." Cynthia could barely speak now. I understand that now, sir." Daniel studied her quietly. "Do you?" The words landed softly, but they carried more weight than shouting ever could. Nobody moved. Nobody dared interrupt. Daniel glanced toward Evelyn again before continuing. "My wife spends most of her time building literacy programs for children who cannot afford books. She visits schools most people ignore. She wears simple clothes because she values people, not appearances. Cynthia lowered her eyes. Daniel's voice never changed. And yet somehow, in my own airline, she was publicly removed from first class because someone decided she did not look wealthy enough to belong there. The cabin remained completely silent. Even the rain outside seemed distant now. Daniel looked around slowly at the passengers who had whispered, stared, and judged. "It is remarkable," he said quietly, "how quickly people reveal themselves when they believe someone has no power." No one could look him in the eye anymore. The silence inside first class no longer felt awkward. It felt heavy. The kind of silence that settles over people when they suddenly realize they have witnessed their own behavior too clearly to escape it. Cynthia stood near the aisle with Daniel Carter's executive identification card still trembling slightly in her hands. Her polished confidence had completely disappeared now, replaced by the quiet panic of someone replaying every decision she had made over the past 30 minutes. Daniel remained calm beside Evelyn's seat, his posture composed, his voice controlled. That calmness unsettled the cabin far more than anger would have, because everyone understood he did not need to raise his voice to command the room. "Sir," Cynthia finally whispered, "I truly apologize for the misunderstanding." Daniel looked at her steadily. A misunderstanding happens when facts are unclear. His eyes briefly moved toward the passengers around them. This was judgment. Nobody spoke. The woman in the cream-colored coat stared down at her hands now, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The businessman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Even the younger attendant looked emotionally shaken by everything unfolding around her. Daniel slowly turned his attention toward the senior executives standing behind him. "How many hospitality training seminars has this airline funded over the past 5 years?" The oldest executive answered carefully. "More than 40, sir." Daniel nodded once. "And yet somehow our staff still believes expensive clothing determines who deserves respect." The words cut through the cabin with quiet precision. Cynthia looked devastated now. "Sir, I never intended to insult Mrs. Carter." Daniel's expression softened slightly, though disappointment remained in his eyes. "Intentions matter less than actions, Ms. Reynolds." Evelyn gently touched Daniel's arm then. A small gesture almost nobody would have noticed if the cabin had not been so silent. He looked down at her immediately. "Daniel," she said softly, "that is enough." Her voice carried no bitterness, no desire for revenge, only exhaustion. Daniel's expression changed the moment he looked at her. The cold edge in his posture faded slightly. This was the woman who had spent years reminding him that power meant nothing without grace. The woman who still volunteered anonymously at public schools despite living a life most people could barely imagine. Evelyn glanced toward Cynthia. "People make mistakes." Cynthia looked stunned by the kindness in her voice. Daniel exhaled quietly before turning back toward the cabin. "My wife believes in second chances," he said. "That is one of the reasons I admire her." The woman in the cream-colored coat finally spoke, her voice smaller now. "Mrs. Carter, I am sorry for what I said earlier." Evelyn gave her a polite nod. "Thank you." The simplicity of that response somehow made the shame inside the cabin feel even stronger, because Evelyn could have humiliated every one of them if she wanted to. Instead, she remained gracious while the people who judged her sat trapped inside their own embarrassment. Captain Harris stepped forward carefully. "Sir, Executive Operations has cleared the flight for departure whenever you are ready." Daniel looked toward Evelyn. "Would you still like to travel today?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "Yes, I would." Daniel nodded once. Then, before stepping away, he looked at Cynthia one final time. The purpose of first class was never to separate wealthy people from ordinary people. His voice remained calm and measured. It was supposed to represent the highest standard of treatment. Cynthia lowered her eyes silently. Daniel glanced across the cabin one last time. Real class is revealed by how we treat people who appear to have none. Nobody moved after he said it. Nobody even reached for their phones anymore. Because somewhere between the whispers, the judgment, and the humiliation, the cabin had stopped feeling luxurious altogether. And in the stillness that followed, everyone on board understood the same uncomfortable truth. The simplest person in the room had carried the most dignity all along. The cabin remained silent long after Daniel stepped away from the aisle. Nobody seemed eager to speak first anymore. The earlier energy of entitlement and quiet judgment had completely vanished, replaced by something slower and heavier. Reflection. Outside the windows, rain continued sliding across the glass beneath the glowing airport lights while the engines hummed softly beneath the aircraft floor. Captain Harris returned to the cockpit, and the senior executives quietly exited through the jet bridge one by one. But the emotional weight they left behind remained inside first class like a lingering shadow. Evelyn leaned back, gently in her seat, staring out toward the wet runway, while Daniel sat beside her for a few final moments before departing the aircraft himself. "You did not have to come all the way here," she said softly. Daniel smiled faintly. "You know I would." Evelyn looked down at her hands. "I never wanted anyone humiliated." Daniel's expression softened again. "You were the only person here trying not to humiliate anyone." She gave a small, tired smile at that. Around them, passengers remained unusually still. The businessman across the aisle finally spoke again, though his voice sounded different now, stripped of the confidence it carried earlier. "Mrs. Carter," he said quietly, "for what it is worth, I am sorry." Evelyn turned toward him with calm eyes. "Thank you." A few rows back, another passenger lowered his phone completely and slipped it into his pocket. Whatever footage he had hoped to capture earlier no longer felt entertaining. The woman in the cream-colored coat sat silently near the window, staring down at the reflection of her own face in the dark screen of her phone. For the first time that morning, she looked uncertain of herself. Cynthia remained near the front galley, motionless beside the beverage station. Her carefully polished appearance now seemed fragile beneath the weight of embarrassment and regret. After several quiet moments, Evelyn unfastened her seat belt and stood slowly. Cynthia immediately looked up, nervousness flashing across her face again. But Evelyn simply walked toward her with calm, measured steps. The cabin watched closely. Cynthia lowered her eyes. "Mrs. Carter, I truly am sorry." Evelyn studied her gently for a moment before speaking. "I believe you are." Cynthia looked surprised by the answer. Evelyn glanced briefly around the cabin. People become so focused on appearances that they stop seeing each other clearly. Her voice remained soft, but every passenger heard it. And when that happens, kindness disappears first. Cynthia's eyes watered slightly. "I will remember that." Evelyn smiled faintly. "I hope so." Then she returned quietly to her seat. No dramatic speeches. No demands. No punishment. Somehow that mercy left. The deepest impact of all. A few minutes later, the aircraft doors finally closed. The soft chime echoed overhead, while flight attendants resumed departure procedures with noticeably humbler voices than before. As the plane slowly pushed back from the gate, the first rays of morning sunlight began breaking through the rain clouds beyond the runway, washing the cabin in pale gold light. Evelyn rested quietly beside the window while passengers around her avoided the arrogance they had worn so comfortably earlier that morning. The atmosphere inside first class no longer felt like a place divided by money or status. It felt human again, and somewhere high above the clouds, as the aircraft finally lifted into the brightening sky, the people inside that cabin carried away something far more valuable than luxury. They carried the memory of a simple woman who had been judged for her appearance, humiliated in public, and still chose grace over revenge. Because in the end, wealth may command attention, but dignity earns something far rarer: respect.